At first glance, the world of Goblin Slayer seems incredibly fun, like a fantastical RPG brought to life. But once you start getting deep into this magical adventure, you slowly come to the horrifying realization that things are about to get much darker than you could have ever expected. And, to be honest, nowhere is this contradiction exemplified better than in the character of the Sword Maiden. Outwardly, she's a kind, compassionate leader, but just behind that facade lies one of the most disturbing backstories ever seen in anime. Thus, in this marvelous video, we're going to be doing a deep dive into this enigmatic character's anatomy and exploring her tragic past. Who is the Sword Maiden? Goblin Slayer is a world that centers around the idea of adventure. It depicts most fantasy tropes and archetypes, but usually in a significantly different light than we're accustomed to. This sensibility extends to all of its characters, including the Sword Maiden, who's a take on the Wise Woman or Shield Maiden archetype that we find in Greek and Norse mythology. However, like most other characters in the series, the Blind Maiden once used to be an adventurer, but many years before the events of the series, a tragic event came to pass which led to her relinquishing her position. Consider this a trigger warning because the events ahead might be too unsettling for some. Many years ago, when the Maiden first appeared, she was just another adventurer, albeit a powerful one. The Adventurers Guild records her as a gold rank adventurer, mainly occupying jobs for the national government. Though we haven't seen the Maiden use her power to their full extent, this achievement is a testament to her skill as an adventurer. During this period, the Sword Maiden also went under the name of the Female Bishop, which isn't quite as intimidating as her current moniker. During one of her missions, she entered a party consisting of the Magic Knight, the Black-Haired Lord, and the Sand Bandit. Well, it turns out that the very first mission with this new party would end in disaster as the Sword Maiden ended up in the Goblins' captivity. And since the Goblins in the Goblin Slayer universe might just be some of the most detestable entities to ever exist, they put the kind maiden through living hell. In the Goblins' clutches, the Sword Maiden is tortured and violated to such an extent that it leaves her permanently traumatized. Eventually, the Sword Maiden does manage to escape, but realizes, to her horror, that her party has already abandoned her. The incident affected the Maiden so deeply that she gave up being an adventurer forever. Even after her return, the Maiden faces continuous rejection because of her failure, which eventually led her to take up work as an appraiser in Fortress City. Some of the spin-off novels shine a greater light on the Maiden's time before the beginning of the series. In the light novel Goblin Slayer Side Story 2, Daikatana, we find the Maiden being approached by two adventurers who wish to get their equipment assessed. However, the Maiden assesses their equipment to be poor, much to their displeasure. When one of them begins to step towards the female bishop, the legendary adventurer known only as the Captain is forced to intervene. Once the assailants had been thwarted, the Captain offered the female bishop a spot in his own party. The Sword Maiden would then accompany them in their quest through the Dungeon of Dead to kill the infamous demon lord plaguing the lands. In Year 1, Volume 1, another light novel, we find the Sword Maiden on the 9th level of the dreaded Dungeon of the Dead. Here, it was the female bishop who convinced her party to go towards the 10th floor in order to confront the demon lord, ensuring the world would be saved. The Sword Maiden is undoubtedly a very unique presence even in the strange world that's Goblin Slayer, and in our next section, we'll be taking a brief look at the features that make her so unique. The enigmatic appearance of the Sword Maiden in Goblin Slayer. In all of her appearances, the Sword Maiden has been depicted as an extremely attractive woman with long tresses of blonde hair that reach all the way down to her ankles. Her skin still bears the mark of the torture she suffered at the hands of the goblins in the form of thin white scars that cover her body. Though most of these scars have healed by the time the plot of Goblin Slayer begins, her eyes remain a prominent reminder of her traumatic past. Her pale blue eyes are mostly covered by a black blindfold, which doesn't seem to hamper her perception as much as you'd expect. In the main story, she sports pristine white robes with blue outlines and golden adornments. Unveiling the complex personality of the Sword Maiden: fear, strength, and vulnerability. As we stated at the beginning of this video, the Sword Maiden is truly a study in contradiction, with personality that can range from regal to absolutely childish depending on the circumstances. To her subjects, she's a kind and compassionate leader who usually doesn't get too upset, but her composure is just a facade that masks her crippling anxiety and depression. The Sword Maiden's experience with the goblins haunts her to this day, to the point that even a mere mention of these evil creatures is enough to make her tremble. Interestingly, not many take her fear seriously, as people believe that a former gold rank adventurer is levels beyond the green scum. However, since the fear is deeply psychological, it renders Sword Maiden fairly helpless while facing these creatures. This eventually became the reason the Maiden hired other adventurers after Watertown's sewers became infested with the perverted creatures. Similarly, when a princess is abducted and taken to the Dungeon of the Dead, her father simply asks the Maiden to go over and rescue his daughter. Instead, the Maiden completely breaks down in response, which exemplifies her crippling fear. Fortunately, her fear has lessened significantly after encountering our protagonist, the Goblin Slayer. Though the Sword Maiden is known for her rationality and calm demeanor, she can also be completely childish in certain situations. What kind of archbishop would rather go to the festival than perform her official duties? She's also visibly fond of the Goblin Slayer to the point that her mood improves whenever he's brought up in conversation. History of the Sword Maiden in Goblin Slayer. The first time the Sword Maiden appears in the main storyline of Goblin Slayer, she's on the lookout for adventurers who can kill the goblin-infested sewers under her city, the Watertown. After hearing of the Slayer's exploits, she recruits him for the job. Eventually, the Slayer succeeds in destroying the portal through which the goblins have been popping up. After this incident, the Sword Maiden's fondness for our protagonist grew steadily as she began to see him as a capable hunter, even though he didn't really share her fear of the creatures. But when the Slayer promises her that he'll eradicate any goblins whatsoever, even the one in the Maiden's dreams, she's moved to tears of joy. The Sword Maiden then appears in Volume 3 of the manga, where we witness her childlike displeasure at her inability to attend the festival. Later, she works with the hero to kill the ferocious Hecatoncheire in the astral plane before the monster can be summoned by the Dark Elf. In the next volume, we see her and the king discuss the problems that have been occurring around them lately. The two share a quiet moment, reminiscing about the old adventures they had been on. In Volume 5, the Goblin Slayer receives a letter from the Maiden, which states that she's finally stopped having nightmares about the goblins since their last encounter. She also requests he undertake a quest to find a noblewoman who had gone missing, slaying goblins. The Maiden eventually starts playing a larger part in the story from the 7th volume onward, where the Slayer hands her several clay tablets to decipher. Eventually, she would be the one to make a horrifying discovery regarding a powerful foe that threatened all creation. Even in these dire circumstances, the Sword Maiden's faith in the Goblin Slayer never wavers, as she states in a letter to the king. In the next volume, we finally catch a glimpse of the Maiden's past and her time as the female bishop. We learn that the female bishop and her party had defeated some terrifying monstrosities back in the day while traveling through the Dungeon of the Dead. In this flashback, the Sword Maiden's fear of the goblins is much more evident, as she seems relieved that their opponents are demons, not goblins. Back in the present day, the Sword Maiden plans to join the King Council with the Goblin Slayer's party as her bodyguards. Along the way, she experiences vivid flashbacks of her torture at the hands of the goblins, but the Slayer is there to console her. At one point, she senses the presence of goblins and states bluntly that she doesn't wish for any of them to live. After getting to the capital, the Sword Maiden learns of the stolen priestess's armor and decides to bring the matter before the council. The council eventually gets word that the princess herself was abducted by the goblins and taken to their nest at the Dungeon of the Dead. The king, who is completely unaware of the maiden's traumatic past, requests that she bring them back, as she's one of only 6 adventurers to have come back from the dungeon alive. Fortunately, before the princess can be forced into accepting this quest, the noble fencer and the Goblin Slayer's party accept the challenge. The maiden uses her past experience in the dungeon to craft the adventurers a map from memory and even gives them a blue ribbon, which grants them further entry into the dungeon. This is also where it becomes evident that the maiden has no plans to become an adventurer again, as she tells the fencer that she no longer dares face her fears. The maiden would later appear inside the dungeon along with warrior priests to take care of the remaining goblins. Though facing the goblins is incredibly difficult for the Sword Maiden, she constantly looks at the Slayer to find strength and courage. In the 15th volume of the saga, the maiden offers her assistance to the Goblin Slayer's investigation into a missing centaur princess. By this point, it's extremely evident that the maiden has fallen for the Slayer and can be seen swooning over him at every opportunity. She is also extremely instrumental in the search for the centaur princess and leads the Slayer to Silver Blaze, someone who fits the description of the missing lady. Though the Sword Maiden appears rarely, she is always instrumental to the plot and keeps driving it forward. Powers and abilities of the Sword Maiden explored. Though it's been a long time since the maiden was an active adventurer, her gold rank proves that she used to be among the most powerful humans on the planet. Moreover, the position as Archbishop grants her significant political and religious influence, which can come in handy at times. Using her knowledge, the Sword Maiden can perform the following miracles. Resurrection. When an injured individual sleeps beside the virgin Sword Maiden, they both can recover from major injuries. However, if the Sword Maiden ends up losing her virginity, another individual is required as a medium for this miracle. Appraisal. This skill allows the maiden to accurately verify the properties and value of any item. Alligator familiar. The maiden used an alligator as a familiar to cleanse the sewers beneath her city. Protection, a defensive miracle that can create a strong barrier to protect the maiden and her allies. In addition to these, she also possesses other miracles such as silence, holy light, and fire. Sword Maiden's gear explored. The Sword Maiden's primary weapon is a unique staff known as the Swords and Scales Staff. Shaped like the sign of the supreme god, it consists of a sword and a scale. It's considered to be a symbol of righteousness and justice. How powerful is the Sword Maiden? As the Temple of Law's Archbishop, the Sword Maiden is considered one of the most powerful characters we've ever seen. She was literally in the party that defeated the Demon Lord, and that has to be one of the greatest achievements in the series. If this lady ever manages to get over her trauma, she could easily be the greatest adventurer we've ever seen. Though she has no innate talents, the lady has worked incredibly hard to gain her skills, and, well, you've just got to respect that level of grit and determination. Why is the Sword Maiden in love with Goblin Slayer? It's definitely no secret that the Sword Maiden is completely head over heels for Goblin Slayer. I mean, the man has made it his life's mission to slay the beings she hates the most, so I guess we can understand her attraction. In addition to this, the Sword Maiden can be seen visibly blushing every time the Slayer's around, and he also shows jealousy when he interacts with other women. Though the stoic masked warrior hasn't picked up on her hints yet, we're all shipping this one really hard, so I guess it's just that author Kumo Kagyu is keeping these two from getting together, but one can hope. Marvelous verdict! The Sword Maiden is undoubtedly an extremely interesting character who could easily be one of the most powerful in the show, but her inability to get past her traumas also makes her incredibly relatable and also reveals how dark this cute fantasy world can really be. But what do you think? What are your thoughts on this character? What are your favorite Sword Maiden moments? Also, what other Goblin Slayer characters would you like us to explore next?